what I would like to do is move on first to our first session, and that is an analysis of the Virginia statewide and delegate elections. We have two speakers scheduled for you, and I'll ask Dr. Quentin Kidd if you'll come on down. And we do have a table here, but you may want to stand until Dr. Holsworth gets here. Every year, we have Dr. Quentin Kidd from CNU, and we also have Dr. Bob Holsworth, who are regular speakers at our events here. Dr. Kidd is definitely a regular. He's a leading analyst. You know about him. You read about him. He's a commentator on Virginia and politics. At Christopher Newport University, he's a professor of political science. He's chair of the Department of Government, and he's director of the Wasson Center for Public Policy. Dr. Kidd received his PhD in political science from Texas Tech University. Now, although he's not quite here yet, let me just tell you about Dr. Holsworth so we don't have to interrupt. Dr. Bob Holsworth is also a regular speaker. They do a tag team every year, and Dr. Holsworth just came into the back, so come on down, Dr. Bob. And he's one of our regulars. He's one of the leading political scientists and analysts here in Virginia. He's authored 5 books, numerous articles on public policy and American politics. He was the founding director of both the Center for Public Policy and the Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at VCU. He received his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So with that, I am going to hand you the microphone, and you can go to it from here. This is our most attended, the most focused session that we do here. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. And I think, yeah, I got that. Yeah. So are we on? All right. Okay. So thanks everybody for having me. Let me just preface this by saying I'm fighting off one of these sort of allergy-driven coughs. So if I start coughing, I'll try to stop it. I'm gonna just say a few words from 10,000 feet. Let Bob say a few words from 10,000 feet, and then we can do some Q&A so you can tell us how wrong we are. Whatever. In order to understand, I think, the elections of last Tuesday, I think you got to go back to the elections of last year. The backdrop is 2016. In 2016, Virginia effectively politically seceded from the South. It was the only southern state that voted for Hillary Clinton. All the other 11 states of the former Confederacy voted for Donald Trump. And that, in my mind, sent a pretty loud signal about where Virginia is politically these days. Since 2009, as you know, in a statewide race, Democrats have won all the statewide races since Bob McDonald. And so 2016 was sort of a test case of, is this really a slightly Democratic state at the statewide level? Is it still competitive? Is it a slightly more affirmed Democratic state at the statewide level? A 5% win last year was a significant win. And then what I think happened this last Tuesday was, actually a week ago this last Tuesday, was a big exclamation point on 2016. Not only is it a democratically leaning state at the statewide level, but voters affirm that with a big exclamation point in 2016. And I think that, in 2017, I think that's the real backdrop of what happened on last Tuesday. If there's any doubt that at the statewide level we're a democratically leaning state, there shouldn't be any doubt anymore. It's pretty clear that the eastern side of Virginia dominates statewide elections. It's pretty clear that Northern Virginia drives that domination. It's pretty clear that, you know, as Northern Virginia goes, so goes the rest of the state anymore in statewide elections. But in addition to that, there was what we could call the Trump effect at play in this election. And I just want to give 2 anecdotal stories about the power of the Trump effect. And Delegate Anderson and I, we were talking about this earlier, and he had heard some similar stories from people that he had talked to. One story is this. I was in the grocery store Tuesday afternoon, election day, and I ran into a friend of mine, and we were talking, and I don't know what his politics are, but I just assume, given what I know about him, that they're Republican voters. He and his wife are Republican voters. He asked me what I thought was going to happen. We talked about it a little bit, and he said, you know, my wife and I came home for lunch today together, and we asked each other, you know, did you vote? And she said, yeah. And she said, you know, I voted straight ticket. And he said, and he paused, and he said, really, he assumed that she was going to vote for the Democrats at the statewide level because she was upset with Trump. And she said, I got into the voting booth and I just decided I was so angry with Trump, I voted straight ticket Democratic. I just couldn't vote for any Republicans because I wanted to send a message about how angry I was. And he said he was really shocked at that because as far as he knew, she had voted Republican all of the life that he had known of her. I was in the last week I was reminded of something that happened to me about 4 weeks ago. I often get asked to talk to these groups, you know, political groups, League of Women Voters, things like that. And I'd been asked to talk to a group of one of these indivisible groups on the Middle Peninsula. And so I went and talked to them. And afterwards, a lady came up to me and introduced herself. She said, "The last time I heard you talk was in this very room about 5 years ago." And I said, "Oh, you know, I was trying to think, when did I talk in this room about 5 years ago?" And I kept thinking, the only time I remember talking was to a group of Tea Party patriots. And I said, "Well, I don't remember ever being in here except for a group of Tea Party groups." She said, "Yeah, that was the group." And I said, "Wait a minute, you were at a Tea Party group and now you're at an indivisible group." And she said, "Yeah, I was so angry at Washington." She said, I'm not a Democrat or Republican, but I was angry at Washington. I got sort of into this Tea Party stuff, but then Donald Trump made me so angry, I came over and started being engaged with this indivisible group and these women that made up this indivisible group. And I thought that was interesting and curious at the time, but after the elections, I look back on that, and I think that is those two cases are representative of that wave that just swept across Virginia, swept a lot of incumbents out of the House of Delegates. And I think that is really what happened. If you look at the Virginia exit polls, 57% of voters said that they disapproved of Donald Trump. 34% of them said that their vote was intended to send a message of disapproval to Donald Trump. That was the second highest thing that drove voters. In terms of policy, healthcare ranked a little bit higher. But the next most important issue for for voters on Election Day was gun policy. And Democrats and Republicans split their votes evenly on gun policy. On gun policy, there was as much enthusiasm on the Democratic side as the Republican side, but it was half the level of enthusiasm for we're trying to send a message of disapproval to Trump. Donald Trump was a factor in the election as big as anything else that went on, and I think that is in part what drove both the Democrats and the Republicans throughout their campaigns. For the Democrats, it served as a uniting force. For the Republicans, it served as a dividing force. So Tom Perriello challenged Ralph Northam in the primary, but as soon as that primary was over, Perriello endorsed Northam and campaigned actively for him. That sent a message to Democratic voters and independents of unity, of cause. Corey Stewart challenges Ed Gillespie in the Republican primary. Ed Gillespie wins by a nose hair. Corey Stewart refuses to endorse him. At one point is quoted as saying, "I'm going to hold my nose and vote for him." It sent a message of disunity to Republican voters and voters that might be inclined to vote Republican. And that disunity caused Gillespie to have to run sort of a two-sided campaign. Neither side he could embrace fully. His heart was on one side. His political consultants told him he had to pay attention to the other side. And ultimately, that caused him not to run the effective kind of campaign that he needed to. And Ralph Northam, despite all of his problems and all of the difficulties he has as a candidate, managed to ride a wave, essentially. And Democrats managed to ride a wave also, a down ticket also. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to let Bob talk for however long you're going to talk, and then we can do questions and answers.
I'm just going to stand up to be a little more comfortable so I can see everybody. First, let me just say it's great to be here again with civics teachers, and having been a teacher, a professor for a long time, it's just great to be in a room full of people who have the same interests. And I thought the way I might just start off is by saying this election was also the 20th anniversary of the 1997 gubernatorial election when Jim Gilmore ran and won as a Republican on a platform of no car tax. And so I have a couple of little quizzes I'm going to start with, you know. And here's the first quiz. What are the 3 localities, jurisdictions, in which Jim Gilmore in 1997 got his highest margin of votes? Not percentage, but where did he get the most votes compared to Don Beyer, his opponent? Number 1, Chesterfield, 25,000 votes. Bob Gibson. Number 2, Virginia Beach. This is a bright, bright group. I'm a little worried about my next question, actually, because I give a bottle of wine away if anybody can answer it. Virginia Beach. Anybody know number 3? Anybody know number 3? Bob, do you know it? Nope. Anybody want another guess? We're sitting here. Henrico. Number 1, number 2, number 3. So if you go back to the presidential election of 1996, Hanover substitutes for Henrico. But there it was. Chesterfield, Virginia Beach, and Henrico. Now, I've been offering a bottle of wine for a year to anyone who can tell me the 3 jurisdictions where both Donald Trump and Ed Gillespie got their highest margins of votes in 2016 and 2017. I was in a room full of Republican office holders and nobody can get it. You got to get all 3 to get the bottle of wine. Randy. Oh, no, 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 no. You got the wrong direction. Shenandoah, not enough people, but it's a good choice, but not enough people. Rona, that's another good choice. That's close, but not right. Bedford's number 1. All right, that's great. Can you get the other 2? Oh, Rockingham's a great choice. It's number 4, just missed. Okay. Number 2, so you had that. The number 2, Hanover. Stayed there. And number 3, Augusta. Okay, so that's where the Republican base is now. It's Bedford, Augusta, Hanover, right? Where they win by 13, 11, 11. Chesterfield went 600 votes for Ralph Northam. In 20 years, 25,000 votes shift. Henrico, Virginia Beach, went for 6,000 votes, Ralph Northam. 20 years, 23,000 votes shift. Hanover County went from 13,000 for the Republicans to 26,000 for the Democrats. 39,000 vote difference. That's what's happening in Virginia. In fact, if you looked at the 10 top localities in Virginia, and I think I could have a Rick Perry moment. I may not get them all right. I may not get to 10. But here's where they were. Fairfax, 137,000 for Northam. The second locality, Virginia Beach, 6,000 for Northam. Third was I think it's Loudoun, actually, Loudoun or Prince William. Loudoun was 23,000 for Northam, Randy. Prince William, 26,000. Northam, right? Chesterfield, number 5. 600 votes. Northam. So then we get to Henrico, Number 6, 26,000. Richmond, number 7, 46,000 for Northam. Arlington, number 8, or Arlington's actually 7, Richmond's 8, 52,000 for Northam. Chesapeake's number 9 there, and that was something like 3,000 for Northam. And then Norfolk is number 10, 23,000 for Northam. So to put the finger on the change that Quentin was speaking about, the 10 largest localities in Virginia all went for Northam. So that tells me something about what's happening in the metro areas, the urban areas, and the suburbs. And the easiest way I have to describe this very quickly is to say, if you divide Virginia geographically, rural Virginia, when I first started looking at Virginia politics, was divided between, 35 years ago, I'm aging myself, between Democrats and Republicans. There were conservative Democrats, but that's how they were in state elections. It's now all what? It's all red, and I think Stephen may show you some maps later, and that's what you have. It's all red. It's hard to find a rural Democrat in the legislature outside of Rosalind Tyler. Cree Deeds calls himself a rural Democrat, but he represents Albemarle and Charlottesville. So he's from Bath County, but that's not where his constituency is right now. So you don't. It's all red, just like it is in the United States. You know, it's all red. The urban areas in Virginia 35 years ago were heavily Democratic. They're still heavily Democratic. The change is the suburban areas. The suburbs have just changed dramatically in Virginia. And so if you go back to 2016, some of the messages that worked very well for Donald Trump in western Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, they don't work in Virginia. I mean, what was he going to do to Washington? Yeah, tell the people in Fairfax that's what you're going to do to them. I mean, it's not a message that carries in that area there. So that's why Ed Gillespie had this tough road to play. What was he going to do about Trump? He's so popular in rural Virginia, but if he gives him a bear hug, he's going to lose even more in northern Virginia. So he eventually wound up with this odd campaign, Trumpism without Trump, on the commercials, and that as a message, it didn't work ultimately there. So you wind up with that. Now, why have these suburbs changed? What's happened, and what happened in this election too? Well, first you had just tremendous demographic change in the suburbs. You know, the school teachers know it first of all, because what you see is that, you know, like Henrico County, about 10 years ago, was a majority-minority school system. So you're seeing the change that, you know, you see it first in the schools. Chesterfield County, changing dramatically, was 75% white in 2000, 67% white in 2010. It's probably ticked down further since then on that front. So you have the demographic change. Secondly, I think we've seen in a lot of elections affluent, educated suburbs, like some of the folks that Quentin was speaking to. Those folks have become less committed to the Republican Party. They're more up for grabs and sometimes even leaning a little more Democratic depending on the election. So that kind of change that you've seen in the suburbs as well. I think in this election, as Quentin said, there's a huge Trump effect, that because what it did was that it not only helped the Democrats with the statewide ticket, it just ruined every Republican on the ticket. I mean, you know, here, Rich Anderson lost, who is one of, voters weren't upset with Rich Anderson. They were upset with whom? Donald Trump. They were just, you know, okay, we've seen these elections before. You know, Democrats faced it over the last 4 years. All of a sudden, people running in the state legislature found out that their ticket mate was Nancy Pelosi. And that's what happened to all these Republicans in Virginia this year who got beat in these districts that Hillary Clinton carried, but Republicans were carrying in General Assembly elections. They didn't carry them this year. The people just came down and voted there. The other point I'd mention is the gender gap was just huge. Like, there are two gender gaps that always occur in American politics. One's with men. They usually support Republicans by about 10 points. Women support Democrats by about 10 points. This time, I think it was about, what was it? 8 or 6 with men or something. And then with women, it was 22. African American women supported, 91% voted for Northam, but he got almost half of white women, which was, given how badly he was defeated in rural Virginia, tells you what was happening in the suburbs among women. And you saw these, and more than that, 11 of the 15 Democrats who were elected were women. Overnight, the Democrats doubled the number of women in the legislature on Democratic women, and no Republican woman incumbent got defeated there. So it was a huge night for women who I think they flew under the radar screen in a number of these elections. That they had these social networks, they knocked on doors. I know that in Henrico and Chesterfield, these folks who the Democratic Party didn't even support, in some instances were very close, and in other instances won because of this. So it was a wave election. It was a remarkable election. It was 2 remarkable elections in a row. I think people saw the direction that this election was going. Nobody understood the magnitude that was going to happen here. And that's what's made politics so fascinating. So I'll end there. And we'd love to take any questions or comments you have. Okay, yeah, go ahead. And if you could stand up so everybody could hear.
So on the night before the election, trending on Twitter was the hashtag Virginia governor election or something. And I really felt like it was a bot, but there kept being a libertarian that would say split the vote, and they were asking for Northam Fairfax and like not the female running. I was wondering if you had any insight as to why that kept trending. Like if it just kept coming and people were talking on it.
So you mean a Northam Fairfax wouldn't be a split the vote?
No, so then it was
So we picked up some evidence in our polling of a Northam-Vogel pattern that didn't seem to play out on election day, but we could pick it up in our polling a little bit, and others could too, which is why there started to be this talk a week, 10 days before the election that, in fact, maybe Vogel was going to win, that there was some suspicion that there might be a Wilder effect going on where people were indicating they would vote for Fairfax and then wouldn't. But it didn't, I don't think it played out on election day. When you look at their vote totals, it didn't look like it played out like that. It looked like people voted straight ticket. I will say this, early on in our polling, we had Vogel doing better than Fairfax in some constituencies that I was surprised about. I had an early poll that showed Vogel winning among African American women over Fairfax, and then Vogel winning among Democrats generally over Fairfax at one point. And when we dug into the data a little bit, what we realized is that Justin Fairfax wasn't known well enough around the state. He spent a lot of time campaigning in the core cities among heavy African American concentrated voters, and that ultimately is what he needed to do. But early on, African American women were picking up the name in the polling. Jill Vogel, Justin Fairfax. They didn't know who Justin Fairfax was, so they were indicating they were going to vote for the woman. That ended up not happening, obviously, because the course of a campaign is designed to introduce yourself, and Fairfax did effectively do that. But we didn't. I don't think the election day actually the split ticket voting didn't happen, even though it seemed like it might be something that was coming.
Yeah, I mean, I think the split ticket, the issue there was that Gillespie lost by so much. So Vogel ran at the top of that ticket. Adams ran second in terms of percentage, and Gillespie ran third. Oftentimes, I think Republican Attorney General candidates run about 2 points better than the gubernatorial candidate because a lot of people see it as a top cop job and Republicans are better on law enforcement. Vogel, I think, was hurt by 2 things. One was the top of the ticket losing by so much. And then I think, secondly, Fairfax did a good job magnifying some of her mistakes in that one debate in which she basically said that Fairfax wasn't informed enough to talk intelligently about the issues.
Really hurt her.
He skewered her, and it gave him a way to get in the news, to get more name recognition again and again, because a lot of people paid attention to that comment. So at least it gave him visibility. I'm not sure people focus that much on LG races, but more people knew who he was. And he didn't have the kind of money she had, and so he had to really. I think he was worried the whole time that, I think a lot of people thought, as happened, she'd run at the top of the Republican ticket, and if it was a 2-point race, it might have been a different outcome. But at a 9-point race, she got swept along with it. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not crazy enough to question your guys' intelligence or your track record. I moved here in '96 from Maine, Virginia Beach. Seeing the shift, with or without Trump, had Hillary won, well, momentum was governor. So my question is, I foresaw a shift at the top of the ticket going north, even if Trump hadn't won. I don't, it's just my personal, the momentum was already going, so wouldn't it carry on, kept going down the track, even if Hillary won last year?
You mean if she had won the presidency? You mean not if she won Virginia. You're talking about if she had won and was in. So I argue, I understand that Virginia is structurally a Democratic state right now. I think Virginia is structurally Democratic anywhere from 1 point to 9 points. I mean, we saw it 9 points. Until last Tuesday, my sense was that Virginia was structurally at the statewide level Democratic from 1 point to 5 points. So I think you're right. I think even if Hillary Clinton had won, Democrats would have had a structural advantage. The question was, could they convert that structural advantage to a majority of votes on election day? So would we have had something akin to a 2009 play out, even if the margins wouldn't have been as large, or would we have something closer to 2013 that would play out? And I think that would have been dependent upon how well Democrats could have turned out their voters. I mean, but in the end, I think in statewide races, Virginia is structurally a Democratic state by anywhere from 1 to 9 points.
Yeah, I think you're right, but let me try to just put it in some context. In the last 2 off-year elections that we had in Virginia, which the Democrats won, okay, since 2005, in elections for governor, Senate, and president, Republicans have only won one of them, Bob McDonnell in 2009. So I think you're right. That's sort of the trend line in Virginia now over almost, over a 12-year period. But in these off-year elections, in the non-presidential years, Republicans have often been very close. So Terry McAuliffe outspent Ken Cuccinelli 4 years ago 7-1, won by 2.5 points. In 2014, which was sort of this anti-democratic wave that went on nationally, Mark Warner ran against Ed Gillespie, won by 18,000 votes, won by less than 1 percentage point. So a lot of folks had thought, this is where the Trump effect, I think, comes in, that the turnout in these off-year elections is about 43% was averaging, compared to presidential elections that average almost around 73%. And there was a sense that the drop-off was steeper among Democrats than Republicans. But what happened this year is that the turnout went way up. It still didn't reach 50%, so there's nothing to brag about, actually. But it went from 43% to about 48%. And what we think is that this turnout increase, which happened everywhere, it even happened in some of these rural areas, but it was greatest in the Democratic areas. For example, the city of Richmond went from 58,000 votes to 71,000 votes, right? That's an over 20% increase in the number of people who voted and 81% of the city voted for the Democrat in that front. So that's kind of what happened. That's sort of the Trump effect, we think, that it boosted the turnout. Now, I would also say there were a lot of people on the ground, not just, the Democrats obviously did a great job through social media getting people out and doing that. But that's where it is. So it's that margin. It was that boosting it to 9. And what we thought was that if it's a 5, let's say, the presidential election was 5 points, we thought coming in with some drop-off, well, maybe it's a 2-point, maybe it's a 3-point race to begin with, and maybe Gillespie has a chance. But when you add the Trump effect in, and then you add the quality of the campaigns, I think at the end of the day it becomes 9.
Yeah, we had it at 6 points in the last poll we put out Monday before the election, and that was assuming a 43% turnout, which is important, because if you assume a 43% as opposed to a 48% turnout, you're dumping out of your surveys a chunk of people that you don't think are likely voters. And so if you add those in, you get that 6% up to 9%. That probably was a 3 or 4% increase in Northam's vote percentage, simply moving turnout from 43 to 48. I think it was 47 point something, about 48%.
Yes, and then there.
Yeah. Two questions. One, so Northam had the widest margin last Tuesday. Does it have anything to do, like, McAuliffe-Cuccinelli was tight, and I think Northam is a moderate. Neither McAuliffe nor Cuccinelli, but it fits that description. But did that help him get to 9 as opposed to 6, where the others, where their margin was? And then also, based on what's happened, it seems that Corey Stewart is dead meat in 2018, which is a long time took between now and then. Who Republicans throw Vogel and potentially have a shot at Kane?
So I relish the Republican primary between E.W. Jackson and Corey Stewart.
What's going to happen?
I hope it happens. I just the pure person who loves politics hopes it happens. Those are two characters that would be fun to watch go at each other. I not to take anything away from Ralph Northam. I think for a significant percentage of voters, he was a vessel. It didn't matter whether he was as moderate as he is, if he was a little bit more progressive more a progressive like Perriello. They needed somebody to vote for to say, I'm angry at Donald Trump, to a certain percentage of voters. Now, if they weren't in the race, if they didn't vote, he perhaps still would have won. I think he still would have won. But I think that to a certain number of voters, it didn't matter that he was moderate. And again, this is why Perriello's endorsing him so quickly after the primary was so important to him, because by endorsing him and campaigning for him, Perriello sent a message to those voters that he's okay, right? That he's worth your support, and that was all they needed. They checked that box, and then they went forward to say, I'm angry with Donald Trump. So, you can criticize the campaign he ran. There were some stumbles late in the campaign. Perriello's endorsement allowed him to step back into his skin and campaign as a moderate person who had moderate views on a lot of issues, and not get punished by progressive voters who wanted Perriello to be the candidate. They were willing to accept him and say, we're going to use him to send the message to Trump. And I think that was probably, of his 9-point margin, I'd guess that was 4, maybe 5% of that margin.
It was in some ways the craziest campaign, because I would go out and, as Quentin did, give a lot of speeches and talks, and I'd ask people, well, what issue is Ralph Northam running on? And no one could name anything. It was a campaign that was primarily about his biography, about who he was rather than what he was going to do for Virginia. Mm-hmm. I think he was going to keep the McAuliffe thing going, and McAuliffe was relatively popular, and I think that was good. But there was no great, if you had to say what was he going to do, it was very difficult to say that. And so it was curious, but ultimately I think that campaign worked because, I mean, what did you know about him at the end of the campaign? He was a doctor, right? Right, served in the military, he was a doctor, served in the, but I mean, if you're going to choose between a doctor and a lobbyist, who are you going to pick these days? You know, a doctor is a profession that hasn't been totally ruined in politics yet. So I think that was important. And it turned out, just fortuitously, that health care is at the top of the list that people voted for. Not that he had a plan, but he was a doctor. And so he's a doctor and he has health care. I mean, that sounds good, right? I mean, that is, and he's always doing something nice in these commercials for some kid. So, I mean, in a sense, that message came across. I mean, that people, you know, for those of us who like campaigns about issues, it was like, oh my God, you know, what's this about? And but at the end of the day, it turned out to be, in this environment, fairly effective. 2018, the problem for Republicans is this. First, all that we've described. It's now a Democratic-leaning state. But here's the second problem they have. There are 34 Senate seats up for grabs next year. Tim Kaine's is one of them. And the National Republican Party is going to have a set of priorities. And so their priorities are going to look like this. Priority number one is holding on to the seats they currently have. That's priority number one for funding. Priority number two is, of those 25 Democrats, I mean, it's a tough road for Democrats next year to gain a Senate majority because it's only three-quarters of the people who are up for election are Democrats. They have to win in these 9 Republican seats. But of the 25 Democrats who are up for election, 10 are in states that Trump won. That's priority number two for the Republicans in their funding. So what happens is it come down to Virginia. Where's Virginia going to be on the priority list? Yeah, it's pretty low. So Carly Fiorina, who ran for president, happens to live in Northern Virginia. A lot of Republicans wanted her to run. She decided, I don't want to spend my own money because I'm not getting party money, and though she has enough money to spend her own money, she didn't want to do it. Jimmy Massey, a delegate for Henrico, who would have ran against Carly Fiorina for the nomination if Tim Kaine had become vice president, he said, you know, how am I going to run in this environment? So the people who are willing to run are the people who are willing to take these flyers. Corey Stewart, E.W. Jackson, Jim Gilmore. I think likely to get back in it, really.
You may have not heard the last of this.
You know, those are the kind of people who will do it. The folks who are looking at, you know, politics in, you know, a very detailed, rational way. What does it take to win? How would I get money and all of that? They're not running in this time. It has to be somebody from kind of outside the normal establishment who's going to do this. Yes?
Appreciate the other questions because they kind of led to what I was asking. Thank you again for being here. My students, I teach senior government, and prior to the election...
And where do you teach?
I teach in Bridgeland County at Patriot High School. We're a diverse, probably we kind of look like the state of Virginia. We have, you know, half Republicans, half Democrats. And they're very vocal, very passionate about their belief in our government. And so prior to the election, I got all the flyers, which I think I had a stack about that piece in my house, divided them out, and the kids basically looked at what the candidates were sending to the houses. And we talked about the election, and we kind of had an estimate of where the county was going and maybe the state. The kids were spot on. They were really good about predicting. And after election, I'm bringing up the big data, and I'm like, we're government. Why do we have all this math up here? And your statement about the data was right on target with my students. And I wish I had your lecture food to my students because they were really intrigued about the numbers. And I told them, I said, politics is all about the numbers. And the thing that I think they're most interested in is why there is a Trump factor. Because they think, well, Prince William, they didn't want Trump. He didn't win the Republican out of Prince William County. So they're like, how is that affecting the rest of the Republicans? And what you've been saying is spot on. Is there anything else I can give them besides what you've been talking about?
About why? Well, I can address the first part and then the next part. If I had to, so when I went to college, I didn't have any clue that I would major in political science anyway. I started out majoring in journalism because I was interested in current events, and I didn't know there was something called political science initially. After having gone through a PhD, if I could go back and do it again, I would major in math and minor in political science, and then go to graduate school in political science because the discipline is as mathematically heavy as it is now. So this is really a data-driven world. In political science, there's a small part of the discipline anymore that doesn't have an empirical backbone to it. Political theory, we're slowly, as a discipline, ceding political theory to philosophy. Many graduate programs now don't offer political theory anymore. They offer formal theory, which is mathematics. And they're ceding political theory to philosophy departments. So it is all data. If you're not comfortable, I literally program, write code as a political scientist. And so if you're not comfortable doing that, then the discipline probably isn't for you. So in my mind, anyway, going forward, unless you're going to do something philosophically oriented. And I think you came out of a pretty data-heavy program, graduate program. So I don't even.
And I try really hard to show that the data-driven components really push the politics. And I talk about them getting out as 17, 18-year-olds, that's an area that they're really looking at trying to target. And the data shows up, it's great.
That's the researcher analyst side of me. I will say, there is a side of me that says, politics is also an emotional gut thing, and I think we do risk losing that side of that, and it's still there. You know, to your point about the Trump effect, why was there a Trump effect? Because that's the emotional gut side of politics. There are a lot of people that simply needed, in a cathartic way, to reject Trump, and they used, Delegate Anderson and others to do that. And that's the emotional gut side of it that I think we risk sometimes losing sight of in this heavily empirically driven world. And I would say Hillary Clinton suffered the consequences of that in 2016 because she relied too heavily on her data analytics team and not enough on the people who understood the emotional gut side of politics that said, look, you need to be in rural Pennsylvania more. And so just to that Trump side of the question.
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things, and Stephen's a media expert, so he'll probably say more later. But one of the things you think about this Trump effect is how much he dominates the media like no person ever. Every day almost is about Trump, right? And if you live anywhere north of Fredericksburg, how much do you read about Richmond? You don't read anything about it. The Washington television stations don't cover Richmond. They just don't do it. So everybody, that's all they're hearing about, right? So that's the first part. The second part that's kind of interesting about this election too, and about Virginia, is remember there are only 2 gubernatorial elections in the country this year. One's in Virginia, one's in New Jersey. And the New Jersey one, almost everyone thought was a done deal from the get-go. That if anything was going to be competitive, Christie was leaving with an 18% approval rating. there after his, sojourn to the beach this summer. There. But so he has 18%. So no one's paying any attention. So what happens in Virginia, which is odd, which is interesting, because we held these off-year elections primarily because a long time ago the Democrats wanted to detach themselves from the national environment. But the irony today is that it's the national environment that dominates the state elections in Virginia, because we're only one of two, and in this time almost one of one. So if you wanted to make a statement about what was happening nationally, and you had a group, where did you come? You came to Virginia with your money. The NRA, Bloomberg, Tom Steyer, California billionaire puts $1 million in to get out the vote. Planned Parenthood. Every group in the world, Americans for Prosperity, threw money into this race. So that by the end of the campaign, I think they were spending $1.5 million each a week on television. So what happened is that we hold an off-year election that the idea was 50 years, 30, 40 years ago to denationalize the race. But in fact, the exact opposite happens. It's a national election, and then all these delegates running find out they're, there. And I'll just tell you the story about my delegate. It was Manoli Lupasi who got beat. And in the last 2 or 3 weeks of this election, I started getting all of these mailers from Lupasi, like every day, often more than one, And then they started getting negative about his opponent, who nobody knew. And I thought, this is kind of odd. So I was out one night with a friend, and I said to her, let's take a look at VPAP, the Virginia Public Access Project, and see if Lupasi has done a poll recently, because it just, this guy's I thought was a fairly popular incumbent. And yeah, there it is, October 26th, he paid for a poll. And obviously he recognized that he probably didn't think he was going to get beat, but that something was happening out there. And that's what was occurring, that this whole race got nationalized at every level. And that certainly exacerbated the problems that Republicans would have in Virginia naturally. So, all the way back.
So a lot of what you, sorry, I'm back up from the Center for Politics. Virginia's becoming more polarized. How is that going to change the political landscape in terms of the types of candidates that are running as the reds get redder and the blues get bluer?
Well, it's, it makes it harder for, and I'm, unfortunately, Delegate Anderson's here, so we're picking on him, but it makes it harder for people who are in their hearts interested in public service and interested in getting things done in a less partisan way in Richmond. It makes it harder for them to do that and get there, in part because they've got to go through the funnel of an election, and so think about who succeeded in the Republican primary last year in June. Ed Gillespie won, but I would argue that Corey Stewart succeeded. And so Corey Stewart, the poster child of the kind of politics you're talking about, didn't win the primary, but succeeded in keeping his political career going and keeping in the news and attention and that sort of stuff. And Ed Gillespie, who in his heart is a policy wonk and wanted to really run on the economy, and I mean, the guy produced 21 detailed policy proposals. I'd moderated a couple of forums with the candidates, and he would come in with these, a stack of policy proposals that were 30 pages thick. That he could talk to you about 18 layers deep of some sort of policy. But he never got to really do that kind of stuff because the race forced him to run in a particular different kind of way. And so I think the end result is it makes it more likely that the partisan extremes end up in the General Assembly. And then the real question for me is the history and institution of the General Assembly such that it pulls those people back in a direction that says, ultimately, this is about working together, or does it, do the institutions in the history give way to the partisan forces that are driving each of the two political parties right now? I don't know the answer to that. What I hope is that the institutions in the tradition pull them in a moderate direction when they're in the General Assembly, and that's my hope anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge is that people come with very different perspectives and from different worlds. I took a look after the election at the platforms of all the Democrats who won, and almost invariably they were what I would call fairness, human rights platforms. With the one person who really had much more detailed, localized platform was Danica Rome.
Yeah.
Who got, who had a very different national perspective, but the local perspective seemed to be there. Yeah, but the reality, I think, is that that's how the parties are moving. But now I think the big issue in Virginia is how does the General Assembly now operate in this situation? And my sense is that it's still in flux, because you have 21 Democrats in the Senate, 19 Republicans. You have 3 runoffs going, where the Democrats have at least 49 seats. I think 2 of the runoffs, recounts, 2 of the recounts, the Republicans would be heavy favorites because there's at least 80 vote difference. But there's this one recount that only has 10 votes. So who knows what will happen. And even if the Republicans stay, there's going to be some shenanigans and maneuvering in the next month or two where the Democrats are going to try to offer a couple jobs to Republicans in the General Assembly who are holding seats that they think they might win, in order to try to find a way to change the makeup of the Senate or the House in that sense as well. And then, so finally, I think what will happen, I think a couple of things that have been on hold have a much better chance of getting passed this year. Some form of Medicaid expansion. I'm not sure they'll call it that. But in the Senate, I think it's almost a done deal, because Emmett Hanger, a Republican, has supported it in the past. He's likely to support it again. And in the House, the Democrats just have to find 1 or 2 Republicans who have a local reason for supporting Medicaid expansion. And if you're in a rural area where your hospital is being challenged or your hospital is having tough times and you think this would help, you might well go over there. So I think you're going to see Medicaid expansion. I think this gives a much better chance than we've ever seen for some kind of bipartisan redistricting reform to come about. It may be okay. It may just be an incumbent protection deal too. So I'm not so absolutely confident that what comes out will be great on that front. But at the same time, there's going to be, Republicans now have to worry like never before. Like the people in the state Senate today have to think, there but for the grace of God go I, that we weren't up for election this year. Because Ralph Northam carried 24 Senate districts in that front. So that's 5 districts that Republicans currently hold that he carried there. So this is a transformation in Virginia politics. Republicans had used redistricting very successfully to maintain and kind of compound their own margins. They don't have that any longer going into, I think, 2019 or likely in 2020. So we're at a time where the General Assembly may begin to change as well.
Let me just make 3 real quick points. 2 years ago, in the 2015, leading up to the 2015 elections, we had this debate on campus between Tommy Norment and Dick Saslaw. We had no statewide races. It was all about the state Senate, who was going to take the state Senate, so we had this debate. And at one point in the debate, redistricting came up. And Tommy Norment shot it down, and he made some comment. I can paraphrase. I'm not going to be able to quote. The House of Delegates will never go Democratic in our lifetimes. And I was trying to find that, and it just occurred to me. in politics, a lifetime can be as short as 2 years. He may prove to be right. I mean, Republicans may still maintain that edge, after all these recounts happen. But boy, what a short lifetime. Secondly, Stephen can talk to this. It's in his backyard. We may actually have to rerun an election. There may be an election where voters got the wrong ballot. And we may have to run one of these elections again. So we may have a seat empty starting when the General Assembly session starts, because the election has to be rerun. And the governor, it would be the governor's discretion within some range as to when to call that rerun election. And
probably call it after they vote on the speaker,
I would
right?
I would imagine it would be after the start of the session, right? That sort of stuff. And then the last point on Medicaid expansion. It is important to understand Medicaid expansion is different now than it was 3 years ago in this sense. The Medicaid expansion bill that Governor McAuliffe wants the General Assembly to pass is simply a request to the federal government to waive the normal rules. It would have been a no-brainer in the Obama years that waiver would have been granted. It isn't clear to me that the waiver would be granted by the Trump administration. And so McAuliffe may achieve his ultimate political objective in getting the General Assembly to approve Medicaid expansion, only to have the Trump administration reject the request to waive the rule. So,
What's the election with the wrong ballot?
Oh, this is the Stanford election. Thomas Cole election.
yeah.
If you could stand up so everyone can hear.
I'm Sarah. I'm going to teach in RPS. So do you see just the Trump effect, especially in media, just becoming more and more of a factor over the next couple of years? I'm assuming we're not going away, but do you see it getting worse?
I don't see Donald Trump changing. I also don't see Donald Trump being impeached, quite frankly. And so I think Trump is there for the next 3 years and some odd months at minimum. And so I think the Trump effect stays. And I think, to Bob's earlier point about, the Senate Republicans saying, thank God I wasn't on the ballot. They are going to be on the ballot in 2 years. And I don't see anger at Trump going away on the part of Democrats. Dynamics of political dynamics change. Things can happen that we couldn't even foresee right now that could change the dynamics of politics, but I just don't see Trump changing. And so Trump is the cause of the Trump effect. And I don't see Trump changing. So I think this is a dynamic Republicans have to deal with for at least the next 3 years and some odd months, and it's a dynamic Democrats have to try to capitalize on for the next 3 years and some odd months.
Do you think it'll bring more? I guess my question was, do you think it'll bring more people out of voter in these off years will continue to go up?
Well, certainly in 2018.
Yeah, I think it might. I mean, I think particularly in these suburban areas where you have just this mobilization going on and changes that are occurring that we've never seen. Like last year, they announced the group of the Liberal Women of Chesterfield County.
Yeah.
And most people thought that was kind of like an oxymoron or something, but then you look at the election results and just stunning things happen. I mean, Riley Ingram won by 800 votes, lost Chesterfield to a woman who had no money, but just had a lot of energy. And if it wasn't for another locality, he would have lost his seat too. I mean, it's just stunning.
Democrats in the House of Delegates are scrambling right now to make sure that all of these newly elected delegates understand what in the world is going on and think about just the logistics of the General Assembly, right? The General Assembly building is under renovation, new construction. They're in temporary headquarters. The Capitol building has been rearranged, their committee rooms where there used to not be. I mean, all of that, and then they've got 7 or 8 people who literally have never sat on as much as a board in a city or county have no clue how a meeting goes on. I was talking to a lobbyist yesterday who told me he was talking to one of these newly elected delegates, and they were talking about the introduction of legislation, and this delegate, no lie, said, "Oh, you mean I can introduce legislation even if it isn't in my committee?" Right? That's the kind of stuff that we're dealing with here. And to Bob's point, there were people that won that the Democratic Party had never supported because they were third-tier candidates. You know, there was no expectation they would win. Their quality in terms of, previous running, previous experience, etc., was zero. So this is going to be, it's going to be an interesting first few weeks of session.
Yeah, I mean, there was this guy in Prince William County, young guy, socialist, 30 years old, calls himself a socialist, and he ran for office because he got ticked off. He was working on a job, and he was doing lighting, and he was damaged by some electrical surge, and he had trouble with unemployment insurance for the Virginia Employment Commission, and said, "Okay, I'm running for delegate." Right? And he ran against the House Majority Whip, who's a former student of mine. He had no money. The Democratic Party cut him off, and he won by 8 points. I mean, how do you explain it? I mean, it's just it's there. Yes, and then and I'll do there. You here, there, and then back there.
I'm George Kusudo. I teach lab, which is over the battleground. I live in Maryland, which is strongly blue. In Frederick City, top 5 aldermen, all Democrats, so that was an interesting parallel. It was also this year. But when you say the Trump effect, certainly I'd be interested to talk to anybody about this, and it takes on a different meaning in the classroom because we civics educators have kind of had to deal with a shift of how, things that are traditionally American, we understand diversity, tolerance, those things, now are pegged as liberal. And so there's a shift going on that we have to deal with in terms of how we teach our kids. And so that's really more just a comment than a question. So I'd be interested to talk about that. But also, how do you see the, especially Barbara Comstock's seat and how that's going to, how it's going to roll in 2018?
No doubt in my mind, and then Stephen can also address, I mean, this is in his backyard. No doubt in my mind, that is the #1 targeted, race for Democrats in Virginia. I think there are two obvious pickups for Democrats if 2018 goes anything like 2017 did. That's Barbara Comstock in the second and Scott Taylor, Barbara Comstock in the 10th, Scott Taylor in the second. Scott Taylor on Tuesday night, gave some interviews where he said, essentially, this is about Trump, you have to admit that. I wish the president would engage in some self-reflection, and I thought, I wouldn't want to be in his mind while he's engaging in self-reflection, but it demonstrated to me that Scott Taylor understood immediately what this meant. Virginia Beach, any Virginia Beach? So Virginia Beach had been trending Republican in statewide races, and it went, 8,000, 10,000 Northam, right? 6,000? So Scott Taylor understood immediately if, there were voters that came out of the woodworks because they were angry at Trump, they're likely to still be angry at Trump next year when I'm on the ballot running for re-election. But Dave Bratt's district, the 7th district, was within a point or two of going Northam as well. And that, in my mind, used to be one of the safest Republican districts in Virginia. And suddenly, well, no, but not, that was an internal Republican thing, right? The 7th may be a hotly contested congressional race next year also. And so, this sort of Trump effect, I think, is going to roll through the congressional races next year in interesting ways as well.
Yeah, Barbara, so on election night, as Quentin said, Scott Taylor comes out and criticizes Trump. Yesterday, Barbara Comstock comes out and becomes the voice of women who are protesting congresspeople who have been engaged in sexual misconduct, basically talking about what she's heard in her experience in her short time in Congress. So both of them very clearly understand that they have to run a different kind of race if they're going to win. And as Quentin said, in the 7th district, Dave Bratt, Northam lost that district. But the Democrats have the potential of nominating a candidate who has the background to be successful there. Now, they have a three-way race, and so I don't know who they're going to nominate. But one of their candidates who has is a woman named Abigail Spanberger from Henrico, who her former job was a CIA operative. And I just think that's like the worst nightmare for Dave Bratt, is to have. Plus,
she's going to be all up in his grill.
Plus, Dave's a good friend of mine. I've served on a nonprofit board with him for years. But the other thing about that I would mention is that her finance person, the person who's actually organizing the finance person, is a huge Republican donor, Bill Royal, who has given hundreds of thousands of dollars and maybe millions to Republicans and is out there organizing the financing for a Democratic candidate for Congress. So that's kind of what we're going to see in 2018 here in Virginia. I mean, it's going to be a wild year in these congressional races, I think. Okay, yes.
Quick question, switching to the national scene, and it bubbled up, I think, in the last few days again. I mean, we've always talked about Virginians running for national office, and certainly Mark Warner some years back, then Tim Kaine, and even now, the Terry McAuliffe buzz is starting. So my question is starting there about with those possible Virginians, and then who else on the national scene for the Democrats would we be looking at as possibilities for 2020?
Well, I would be shocked if McAuliffe doesn't run. So that's how confident I am that he's going to run. And the other names you're hearing are people like the New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, Elizabeth Warren, Camilla, the senator from California, people like that. What I haven't heard that I'm interested in and curious about is who are those candidates in my mind represent kind of the progressive left wing, the sort of middle left somewhat of the party. Not so much with Terry McAuliffe, but I think he can claim that if he needs to. You're not hearing the sort of moderate to right side. You're not hearing a lot of names out of that wing of the party yet. I mean, Joe Biden's name gets floated around. So in some ways, I think it's too early. I mean, it's never too early, but it is too early to know fully what the field is going to look like. But I think 2018 is going to either turn on or turn off a lot of those potential candidates because, that'll just tell a lot of them give a lot of them either optimistic views or negative views about their potentiality for running. But right now, the names you're hearing seem to come out of the left side of politics and seem to be relatively new to politics other than Joe Biden. New to elected politics.
Yeah. Who's not running? That's the question there. On McAuliffe, this was a huge win for McAuliffe on Tuesday night.
Yeah.
Not just because Northam ran, but because it changed the nature of Terry McAuliffe's, or potentially, put it this way, changed the nature of Terry McAuliffe's national identity. That until Tuesday night, Terry McAuliffe was simply a Clintonite. He had been the fundraiser for Hillary and Bill, head of the Democratic National Committee for Bill. That's all he was on the national stage. He'd been a good governor in Virginia, and he wanted to run on his gubernatorial record. He's now the man who defeated Donald Trump, and Trump's going to say, well, I wasn't involved, I didn't have anything to do with it. But on the Democratic national side, Virginia was sort of the first success of the resistance. Because the Democrats came close, remember, in all these other sort of high-profile things, the Georgia election and the like. McAuliffe now has a huge victory in which he can then make his argument. I still think it's an uphill climb for him, but I believe he's running, and now he has something, and he has the personality to take Trump on. That's the other thing that a lot of the Democrats don't. He can deal with that pretty easily. So I think he's now a contender on that front. I think everybody else is running. Mark Warner would love to run for president, but the challenge is, just as Quentin said, so much of the energy on the Democratic side on the left. And maybe if there's 12 people in the race and you're the one guy in the sort of center right, you might have an opportunity. But I'm not sure that you could have two people from the same state running, but we'll see there. Yes?
I have one other question to keep prepared today for you guys to love. So I use the YLI allows you to create your own complex. So I'm in Union County, 97, and I live in 96. So when I do this for the students, like the numbers only supported, so I was looking at the last three elections for the off-year elections. So the numbers only supported Gillespie, like it was only 55% of the students at Gillespie because he kind of gets highly Republican. So I predicted that North would win based on that because that was the math opposed to Donald Clinton. The numbers actually came in for New Kent at a much higher percentage than the Republicans had one. And then as the numbers are coming in on Tuesday night, I'm looking at many of the counties that my family lives in because we're not in cities. And in some of those red Republican areas, the percentage of Republican turnout was much higher than usual. Is there any future, like, for the Republican rural areas to sort of knock out those urban and suburban areas, or is really the suburbs what is going to decide Virginia's election?
The problem is to your first point, Ed Gillespie got more votes for a governor ever in the history of Virginia, except for Ralph Northam. So what it amounts to is that both sides did a really good job of turning out their bases, their core supporters, and then the Democrats had it added on top of that this group of voters that were driven by things that were outside party mobilization to some extent, and that amounted to the 9-point win instead of 4 or 5-point win. To your second point, there just aren't enough bodies. I mean, as Lyndon Johnson once said, just because you're dead doesn't mean you can't vote. I suppose if every cemetery voted, then maybe. But there aren't enough bodies in rural Virginia to match it. Once 500,000 in an off-year election like this, once turnout in Northern Virginia, Arlington, Alexandria, Fairfax, Loudoun, Prince William, goes over 500,000, it's almost a done deal for Republicans. They just cannot match the 35% of the total vote that comes out of Northern Virginia. And then you add the Richmond metro area, the increasingly Democratic Henrico County, now the competitive Chesterfield, the core cities in Hampton Roads that are heavily Democratic, and now what seems to be a competitive Virginia Beach that might go Democratic in some races. There just aren't enough bodies in rural Virginia to match that. I mean, that's the hard reality, the hard math that Republicans in Virginia face statewide.
I would agree, actually, that I think, there are some of these ex-urban areas, formerly rural areas, that are now getting some suburban type of development where Republicans are still doing well. New Kent, I think, one of them. Bedford's another there. But, the reality is in rural Virginia, how much more can you max out? I mean, you're getting 80% of the vote on the Republican side, and that's not enough there. So, I mean, the Republicans have to find ways of doing better in the suburban areas. They have to find, the other point we have to say is that there's a ethnic racial dimension to this. Sort of the Caucasian Europeans, there used to be 80% of the population, there's 70% of the population now. And Republicans lost the non-white vote by 80 to 20. So the Republicans have to find, their challenge is to find a message that can unite those rural voters with the suburbanites. Now, Gillespie had hoped that this crime message about gangs and MS-13 would do it, but it turned out not to have much traction, actually, I think. So we'll see. Let's,
How long do we?
You're good for another 15 minutes if
Okay.
people still have questions.
Okay, yes, the four House races, I think Bernie briefly mentioned it, where they all went R. But didn't the D's overperform? In other words, they were like pretty staunch R districts. And instead of losing by 20 points, Democrats lost by like single digits. Is that correct of those other four House races? Because Trump tweeted that after the election. Hey, I won these four, even though they got slaughtered here. Do you know what I'm talking about? You mentioned the Georgia race. That's one of the four. Right.
Yeah.
They all went R, but I'm saying, did the Democrats overperform?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
right, on the national race.
Yeah. I don't know the number. I don't know the numbers, but you're right. I mean, a classic example is the state senate district. What is it? 37 in Oklahoma. That was a plus 30 Trump district that the Democrat won by a little bit. So Democrats are overperforming, but in some of these congressional districts where the margins for Republicans were huge, overperforming by 15 or 20 points still doesn't get you a win. And that's what Trump was, I don't know I can't remember what four of those races he was referencing, but.
Yeah, I thought the Ossoff race where he lost in Georgia was related to ultimately he was not a good candidate because he was such a young guy. He had no experience of doing anything for the community, right? Didn't live in the district, you know. He ran a good race, but no one knew him. I think if they had put up somebody with a better reputation in the community, they might have actually won that race as well on that front.
Yes.
I was wondering, do you think this Roy Moore fiasco is a chance for the Republicans to rebrand themselves? You know, if he wins by whatever, he gets in, they expel him, and then they can rebrand themselves, moral authority, maybe regain some votes of women in the country?
The problem, so your question assumes something that I think is not right, and that is that this is top down. I actually think it's bottom up. Who's going to rebrand the Republican Party if the base of the party is what it is? Just like the Democratic Party has struggled over the years with its left and moderate wings, wherever the energy is going to define who that party. So right now, the energy in the Republican Party is the energy that elected Donald Trump last year, and the energy that may send Roy Moore to the Senate, despite whatever happens and whatever comes out between now and Election Day. Mitch McConnell can't rebrand that. They would vote Mitch McConnell out in a heartbeat if they could. And so in some ways, the party is the people who make the party up. It isn't the people who are elected and who speak for the party. And oftentimes, I mean, that's the mistake that party leaders make, is that they assume they have far more control over the millions of people that make up their party than they really do, and they end up losing big, elections or having other big consequences happen to them. I mean, this is what happened to the Republican Party. I mean, if you listen to the people who voted for Donald Trump, they were frustrated at their own party, right? And so I would say no. The Roy Moore election, whatever ends up happening, is a reflection of the base of the party in Alabama, whether Mitch McConnell likes it or not.
I just want to know about this Alabama high school principal's office that got the phone call from Roy Moore that he wanted to talk to the girl in the trigonometry class and announced on the intercom that she had a phone call and please come to the office. I mean, that is just unbelievable.
I mean, you can't make
that up.
Right.
I mean, do you have a principal that would do that? I mean, yes.
I have a question, but actually, since they said that, I'll respond to that. I used to teach in the Plain High School in Fairfax, and it was long enough ago I taught children from the Strong Thurman second family, and they were routinely called to the office for a call when a call came from the senator's office.
But they were family members.
Well, yeah.
Somebody said he wanted to date.
As a proposition, I would argue, for the sake of debate, that the Republican Party has no intellectual or philosophical basis anymore, and that has been on the downtrend since sort of the moral majority, or maybe the 60s, the Barry Goldwater and the conscience of a conservative. I'm not sure the Democrats do either. So, but anyhow, and I know Jeff Flake has written a new thing, but again, just as a moral or philosophical or intellectual basis for their being, and so argue.
I wouldn't agree with that. What I would argue is that both parties, remember, we don't have a parliamentarian system where American society is no different from any other society in the world in the sense that there are many different views about what government should or shouldn't do, what society should or shouldn't look like. In many other political systems of the world, those different views are allowed to be reflected by smaller, niche political parties. Look across Europe, and you've got Spain and France and Germany that have 24 political parties that can represent the. We don't have that. We have a political system that essentially forces all of these different philosophical views into one or two political parties, or to wander as independents, right? And so both the Republicans and the Democrats have competing intellectual cores and competing philosophical views. And there are times in our history where those competing views clash more harshly than at other times. And I think we're living through a time right now where both in the Democratic and Republican parties, the philosophical views are clashing, more so in the Republicans right now, but the Democrats have their own clashes as well. And so I would argue that rather than no intellectual or philosophical core, it's multiple competing philosophical and intellectual cores that are clashing with each other. That would be my view of things.
I'll go on to the next question.
Yes.
Orange County, you alluded to redistricting. I was wondering, by 2020, the Democrats took the majority in the Federal Assembly. Would they go with the independent commission, or would they go to the same old political gerrymandering?
There would be a big fight because Dick Saslaw is perfectly happy with the way it's done, and a lot of Democrats have hung their hats on redistricting reform. A Democrat, one of the leaders of the Democratic caucus in the House said to me yesterday, "We've caught the car. We're the dogs that caught the car." In other words, we don't know what to do. We're trying to get it all figured out. And one of the things that they've got to deal with is they have hung their hat on redistricting reform. If they end up owning the House of Delegates and the Senate and the governor's mansion, they're going to be hard-pressed not to pass some sort of redistricting reform, and they're going to have a fight about it internally. And so it's a very good question. I would argue that if the governor is forcefully behind it, then the Democrats might manage to do it. But would it be the kind of reform that they've advocated, which is essentially take it out of the hands of the legislature completely and give it to an independent body? I would not be surprised if that didn't happen. Put it that way.
The votes in the past have been somewhat cynical on this, I think. And here's how I would describe it. The House has been absolutely against it. So it's been a free vote for Democrats in the Senate to be for it, because a lot of their supporters are for it and the like. But I've always been skeptical about how much they're really for it. We'll have to see.
Quentin and I actually served on when Bob McDonnell established this independent bipartisan redistricting commission to draw these sort of neutral maps. You might recall when they were given to the Senate, Dick Sasslaw couldn't get them into the garbage can quickly enough. So we'll have to see if it advantages the Democrats to keep the same system. Will they actually put principle over expedience in that? So that, and everybody points to, well, the Senate's already for it. Well, maybe. They've never had to have a real vote for it. They've had a free vote because they knew the House was going to stop it. We'll have to see what happens in that situation. And finally, I don't necessarily believe,
Excuse me. I don't necessarily believe, just like Quentin, I agree with him, that what you'll get is something that's kind of truly independent. I think what they'll call it is bipartisan redistricting reform, and that is and we've seen in other states, is typically an incumbent protection scheme.
And I would say redistricting reform became an issue in Virginia after not after the last round of redistricting, but after the round of redistricting the Democrats controlled and gerrymandered, and then the wave in the early 90s that brought Republicans in overcame that gerrymandered, democratically gerrymandered system. So redistricting reform actually has its roots, modern redistricting reform in Virginia has its roots in frustration at how the Democrats gerrymandered. And then it sort of got focused on the Republicans because they controlled the last round. So it is, the parties are bipartisan in their guilt at how they've redistricted and gerrymandered, which is what makes me skeptical about what would really happen.
Let me just make one more comment about this. People who believe that redistricting reform is going to make elections more competitive across the board are probably too optimistic. Because as we've talked about today, people's political views increasingly relate to where they reside. So you could draw the lines in Southwest Virginia 20 different ways. It's going to be what? Red. Go to Eastern Northern Virginia. Draw those lines any way. It's going to be what? So it's not so I'm in favor of neutral redistricting reform, largely because I think it might make it easier for citizens to understand who their representatives are. Right? Quentin alluded before to this issue they have in Stafford, where people in the same precinct are voting for different members of the legislature. It makes no sense to have that going on. But if you were going to actually use redistricting reform to make things more competitive, you'll wind up with crazy lines that don't respect jurisdictions or communities of interest.
You would have to gerrymander, to literally gerrymander to create 100 competitive House of Delegate seats and 40 competitive Senate seats. Yeah. You would have to do gerrymandering to do that.
Yeah.
And I think there is a simple solution in some ways. I don't know that I think it could be constitutional. The General Assembly could pass a law that prohibited the use of any partisan data about individual voters in the process of redistricting, and that might ease up a little bit on the partisan gerrymandering, but it wouldn't solve the geographical issue, which is that we're sorting these days, and you know, you can't force people not to live where they want to live.
I mean, people in our business talk about whether you live in a Whole Foods county or a Cracker Barrel county.
Right.
I think well, let's just say one other thing. I think both Quentin and I want to applaud Delegate Anderson for the incredible public service he did as both in his service in the military, his service as a delegate. He was one of these victims of this wave that happened, we think, and been an extraordinary legislator. I've had the pleasure of knowing him for a number of years, know how he grapples with difficult issues, how everything he did is really to benefit the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I think regardless of what you think of the partisan nature of this election, it is a loss to have a person like Delegate Anderson not in the Assembly next year. So.
I voted for him.
I got one vote. Yes, and thank you both so much. You're such a core part of what we do every year here. Thank you. All right, what we're going to do now is, well, let me just say two things. Thing number one, this nonpartisan redistricting, Delegate Steve Landis and I carried a bill this year to do just that, to prohibit the use of all of this political data in order to draw those districts. It died in a House Privileges and Elections Subcommittee, but there are always future opportunities, right? Second thing is, you said that you would like for your students to be able to see this. We have, I hope I get this right, WHRO television is here, and they are recording this, and it will be posted. The goal is by the end of the year on the Virginia Department of Education website, and they have the addresses of all of you who are here, and so they will push out a notification with a link when you can do that. There are also various publications that the department distributes, and they will also publicize it there. So you'll be able to show all or some of this discussion to your students. So with that, we're scheduled to take a 15-minute break. Would you please be back in here no later than 5 minutes before the hour, please? Thank you.